On a cold November morning in 1919, a young man with neatly parted hair stood behind a desk in Washington, D.C., holding a stack of index cards that could destroy thousands of lives. Outside, America believed it was safe. Inside that room, fear had already won. He was only 24 years old, and he was about to change the United States forever. America had just survived a war it barely understood. The Great War, what later generations would call World War I, ended with parades, brass bands, and the comforting illusion that democracy had triumphed over chaos. Soldiers came home believing they had saved civilization. Politicians spoke of peace. Newspapers promised prosperity. But beneath the flags and speeches, something darker had taken root. Fear. Fear of immigrants, fear of radicals, fear of ideas. And fear, when fed correctly, becomes a weapon. In 1919, bombs exploded in American cities, not on battlefields overseas, but on quiet residential streets. One detonated outside the home of the U.S. Attorney General. Another shattered windows near Wall Street. No army claimed responsibility. No foreign flag was raised. The enemy, Americans were told, lived among them. They spoke with accents. They read strange books. They believed the world could be different. And someone needed to stop them. That someone was not the president, not Congress, not the Supreme Court. It was a boy who believed in paper. John Edgar Hoover was born in 1895, the son of a strict civil servant in Washington, D.C. He grew up believing in order the way other children believed in God. Rules were not suggestions, they were moral laws. Filing systems were not clerical tools, they were instruments of control. While other young men dreamed of adventure, Hoover memorized names. He studied law at George Washington University while working at the Library of Congress, where he discovered his true calling, not justice, but organization. He learned that information, when categorized properly, became power. And America was about to hand him more information than any human had ever held. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia sent shockwaves through the United States. Newspapers screamed headlines about communists overthrowing governments, executing elites, and abolishing religion. To many Americans, it felt like the apocalypse had a political ideology. Immigrants, especially those from Eastern Europe, became immediate suspects. Were they workers or revolutionaries? The government decided not to find out individually. They would assume the worst. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer authorized a sweeping campaign to root out subversives. Warrants were optional, evidence was flexible, fear was sufficient. And Hoover was placed in charge of the engine. He designed a system that tracked political beliefs instead of crimes. Names were collected from union meetings, bookshops, churches, and neighbors with grudges. Files grew by the tens of thousands. Men and women were arrested without charges. Families were separated. People were deported to countries they barely remembered. The public applauded. The newspapers praised efficiency. Hoover took notes. What most Americans didn't realize was that this was not a temporary emergency measure. It was a prototype. Hoover learned which lies sounded like patriotism, which fears justified brutality, which politicians asked no questions as long as results looked impressive. By the time the Palmer raids collapsed under legal scrutiny, Hoover emerged unscathed. He blamed others, he archived the damage, and he waited. In 1924, quietly and without ceremony, John Edgar Hoover was appointed director of a small, obscure agency called the Bureau of Investigation. Almost no one noticed. That would be their last mistake. Part 2. In Washington, power rarely announces itself with trumpets. It slips in quietly, takes notes, and waits. By the mid-1920s, the Bureau of Investigation was officially small, underfunded, and politically insignificant. Unofficially, it was becoming something else entirely. J. Edgar Hoover understood a truth that most men in power missed. Institutions do not rule nations, information does. He began rebuilding the Bureau not as a police force, but as a memory. Every agent was trained to observe, not intervene, to record, not question. Hoover banned improvisation. He demanded reports so detailed that a man's posture, accent, and hesitation became data points. Mistakes were unforgivable. Loyalty was everything. Agents who asked mortal questions were quietly transferred, then fired. Agents who obeyed were promoted. Hoover's real innovation wasn't technology, it was psychology. He taught his men that America was fragile, constantly on the edge of collapse, and that only vigilance, unceasing, invisible vigilance, kept chaos at bay. This belief bonded them more tightly than any oath, and it gave Hoover something priceless: fear with a uniform. The Roaring Twenties roared mostly for the wealthy. For farmers, laborers, and immigrants, it was a decade of instability. Strikes erupted across the country. Workers demanded better wages. Unions organized in factories and mines. To Hoover, none of this was economic. It was ideological contamination. The Bureau began quietly expanding its scope. Criminal investigations blended seamlessly into political surveillance. Communists were watched, socialists were watched, pacifists were watched. Anyone who believed the American system could be improved was by definition a threat to its survival. Hoover created indexes within indexes. A person wasn't just a name, they were a web of associations. Who they spoke to, what they read, which meetings they attended, whose hand they shook. Guilt was no longer individual, it was contagious. Then came the Great Depression. In 1929, the illusion of American invincibility collapsed overnight. Banks failed, breadlines stretched for blocks, families lost homes, farms, dignity. Desperation radicalized people faster than pamphlets ever could. Hoover saw opportunity. As Americans questioned capitalism itself, Hoover positioned the Bureau as the last line between order and revolution. He fed newspapers stories of looming uprisings, exaggerated threats, and foreign agitators manipulating the poor. Fear redirected anger, not at Wall Street, but at them. Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933 promising hope. The New Deal expanded the federal government in ways America had never seen. Hoover publicly supported the president. Privately, he monitored him. Hoover learned early never to trust politicians. Administrations came and went. Files endured. He instructed agents to collect information on congressmen, senators, judges, journalists, anyone with influence. Nothing was too small. Affairs, drinking habits, financial trouble, private opinions. Most files were never used. That was the point. Power wasn't pulling the trigger, it was knowing you could. Ironically, Hoover's public reputation was built not on surveillance, but on violence. The 1930s gangster era, John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and Bonnie and Clyde, gave Hoover the narrative he needed. He transformed the Bureau into a heroic crime-fighting force, rebranded as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI became modern, professional, scientific. The Americans loved it. What America didn't see was that for every criminal file closed, 10 political files quietly grew. World War II changed everything again. Fear returned.
this time justified, visible, global. Hoover expanded domestic intelligence operations under the banner of national security. Japanese Americans were surveilled before they were interned. Activists opposing the war were tracked as potential traitors. Hoover supported the war effort completely because war made his job permanent. Emergencies never ended, they only changed names. By 1945, Hoover was no longer just a bureaucrat, he was a fixture. Presidents consulted him, Congress deferred to him, the public trusted him, and behind locked doors, his files whispered secrets about nearly every powerful person in America. He had outlasted rivals, he had buried scandals, he had rewritten his own failures.
Part 4. When J. Edgar Hoover died, Washington exhaled. Not in relief, in uncertainty. For nearly half a century, power in the American security state had a single human shape. Now that shape was gone, but the architecture remained, vast, invisible, and humming quietly beneath the surface of democracy. The question was never whether Hoover's system would survive. The question was whether anyone could control it. In the months after his death, investigators entered Hoover's office like archaeologists stepping into a sealed tomb. Drawers were locked, cabinets were marked in code, entire rooms existed solely for storage. Files on presidents, files on senators, files on activists, judges, journalists, businessmen, lovers, enemies. Some documents were shredded immediately. Others were quietly transferred. Many were never accounted for. Hoover had designed his legacy the way he designed everything else, fragmented, deniable, and impossible to fully dismantle. The 1970s briefly offered something radical: accountability. The Watergate scandal shattered public trust in government. Suddenly, Americans were willing to believe what Hoover's critics had warned for decades, that secrecy breeds abuse. A church committee in the Senate exposed illegal surveillance by the FBI, CIA, and NSA. Americans learned that their own government had spied on them, lied to them, and manipulated them. For a moment, it seemed like Hoover's ghost might finally be laid to rest. Reforms were passed, oversight committees formed, intelligence agencies promised restraint. And then fear returned. The Cold War intensified, new enemies emerged, new justifications followed. Technology advanced faster than law. Wiretaps became data collection, physical files became databases. Surveillance no longer required agents in trench coats, it required servers, and servers do not forget. By the late 1990s, intelligence agencies spoke a new language: metadata, signals, patterns. It sounded neutral, scientific, objective, but the logic was familiar. If you collect everything, you don't need suspicion. Suspicion emerges automatically. September 11, 2001 ended the post-Hoover hesitation. The attacks shocked the nation into unity and into compliance. Americans demanded protection. Politicians delivered authority. The Patriot Act expanded surveillance powers overnight. Warrants became flexible. Secrecy expanded. Oversight weakened. It was all legal. That was the difference. Hoover bent the law. His successors rewrote it. The National Security Agency quietly became the most powerful intelligence organization in history. It did not target individuals. It collected systems, phone calls, emails, internet activity. Everyone. The logic was simple. If danger could come from anywhere, everything must be watched. When Edward Snowden revealed the scope of modern surveillance in 2013, the reaction was strangely familiar: shock, denial, justification. Some called him a traitor, some called him a hero. Most Americans shrugged and returned to their screens. Surveillance had become invisible, and invisibility is the final form of power. Hoover never saw smartphones, he never imagined social media, but he understood human behavior. He knew people would trade privacy for comfort. He knew fear could be renewed endlessly with new names: communism, terrorism, extremism, misinformation. The enemy changes, the structure remains. Today, Americans debate freedom on platforms that monitor every word. They organize protests through networks that log every movement. They distrust government while feeding it data voluntarily. Hoover once needed informants. Now, people inform on themselves. History rarely ends with villains defeated. It ends with systems normalized. J. Edgar Hoover is remembered as a man, controversial, complex, flawed. But his true legacy is not his life. It is the quiet assumption that someone is always watching, and that this is the price of safety.